The crisp autumn morning at Sweet Pine Grove's local grocery store started like any other for Mrs. Robinson, a dignified 73-year-old grandmother who had lived in the community for over 4 decades. Her weathered hands gripped her worn leather purse as she carefully selected fresh vegetables for her famous Sunday family dinner, a tradition she had maintained since her late husband's passing 15 years ago. At the checkout counter, she fumbled slightly with her wallet, her arthritis making it difficult to sort through her cards. The young cashier smiled patiently, but the growing line behind her made Mrs. Robinson increasingly anxious. She could feel the weight of impatient stares on her back, but she maintained her composure, just as she had done throughout her years as one of the first black teachers in their local high school. As she loaded her groceries into her old but well-maintained car, Officer James Patterson pulled into the parking spot next to her. He was new to the force, barely 30, with a reputation for being overzealous and quick to judge. He watched as Mrs. Robinson accidentally dropped a bag, spilling some oranges that rolled under her car. "Ma'am, is this your vehicle?" Officer Patterson's tone was immediately confrontational, his hand resting unnecessarily on his belt. Mrs. Robinson straightened up slowly, her knees protesting the movement. "Yes, officer, I've had this car for nearly 20 years now." The officer circled the vehicle, his boots clicking against the asphalt. "There's been reports of suspicious activity in this area. Could you show me your registration and license?" His voice carried across the parking lot, drawing attention from other shoppers. Mrs. Robinson maintained her dignity as she opened her car door to retrieve the documents, her hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the frustration of being treated this way in her own community. She had seen this kind of treatment before, had lived through decades of it, but it never stopped stinging. "These documents seem awful old," Officer Patterson remarked, flipping through them with obvious skepticism. "Are you sure this is your current registration?" His tone suggested he didn't believe her, despite the documents being perfectly valid. "Officer, I've lived in Sweet Pine Grove since before you were born," Mrs. Robinson replied softly but firmly. "I taught at Pine Grove High for 35 years. You can ask anyone in this parking lot who I am." But Officer Patterson wasn't listening. He was too busy radioing in to check her plates, speaking into his radio loud enough for everyone to hear, treating her like a potential criminal rather than the respected community elder she was. Several onlookers had stopped to watch, some recording with their phones, others shaking their heads in disapproval at the officer's behavior. Mrs. Robinson stood there, her grocery bags forgotten, feeling the weight of decades of similar encounters pressing down on her shoulders. But there was something different in her eyes today, a quiet strength that came from knowing that times were changing, and that justice had a way of revealing itself in unexpected ways. What Officer Patterson didn't know, as he continued his unnecessary investigation, was that this situation would soon take a turn he never expected. The identity of Mrs. Robinson's son would soon make him deeply regret his actions, but for now, she stood there with the patience and grace that had carried her through much harder times than this. Meanwhile, one of the onlookers had already pressed send on a message that would set in motion a chain of events that would change Officer Patterson's perspective forever. The autumn breeze carried fallen leaves across the parking lot, and with them, the whispers of change that were about to sweep through Sweet Pine Grove. As the confrontation continued in the grocery store parking lot, a younger woman stepped forward from the growing crowd. She was Mrs. Thomas, the current principal of Pine Grove High, and one of Mrs. Robinson's former students. "Officer Patterson," she called out firmly, "I can vouch for Mrs. Robinson. She taught me American literature 20 years ago." But Officer Patterson barely acknowledged Mrs. Thomas's intervention. Instead, he was scrutinizing Mrs. Robinson's driver's license with exaggerated suspicion. "The address on this license, how long have you lived there?" His questions continued, each one more condescending than the last. Mrs. Robinson's groceries sat forgotten in the shopping cart, ice cream slowly melting in the autumn sun. She thought about her son, who had always told her to record such encounters, but her old flip phone lay buried somewhere in her purse. Not that it mattered, at least 5 people were already recording the incident on their smartphones. "Young man," Mrs. Robinson spoke with the same calm authority she had used in her classroom for over 3 decades, "I built that house with my late husband in 1975. We raised our children there, including our son, who dash." "Ma'am, I'm not interested in your family history," Officer Patterson cut her off, his impatience growing. "I need you to explain why your car matches the description of a vehicle involved in a series of recent thefts." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the onlooking crowd. Mrs. Robinson's beige 2003 sedan was about as suspicious as a garden gnome, and everyone knew it. She drove it to church every Sunday, to the grocery store every Wednesday, and to her weekly volunteer sessions at the local library where she read stories to children. Meanwhile, inside the grocery store, the young cashier who had served Mrs. Robinson was on the phone, her voice urgent but quiet. "Sir, you need to know what's happening in your mother's driveway right now." "Yes, it's Officer Patterson." "No, she's okay, but..." Back in the parking lot, Officer Patterson was running out of excuses to prolong his harassment. The registration checked out. The license was valid. The car had no violations. Still, he persisted, "Step away from the vehicle, ma'am. I need to conduct a search." Mrs. Robinson felt her heart racing, but decades of facing discrimination had taught her to keep her composure. She thought of her son's words during their last Sunday dinner, "Mama, times are changing, but some people still need to learn the hard way." Just then, a sleek black SUV with government plates turned into the parking lot, tires crunching over fallen leaves. The crowd parted as the vehicle came to a stop nearby. Officer Patterson was too focused on his investigation to notice, but Mrs. Thomas smiled knowingly. She had taught both Robinson children, and she knew exactly what was coming. Mrs. Robinson watched the SUV, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Her son had always been protective of her, ever since he was a little boy who would stand up to playground bullies picking on his friends. Now, after decades of hard work and dedication, he had become someone whose mere presence commanded respect, not through force or fear, but through his unwavering commitment to justice and equality. The SUV's door opened, and a polished shoe stepped onto the asphalt. The crowd grew quiet, phone still recording, as a distinguished-looking man in a perfectly tailored suit emerged. His presence carried the weight of authority that couldn't be mistaken, and his face bore a striking resemblance to Mrs. Robinson's. Officer Patterson was still thumbing through Mrs. Robinson's documents when a deep, authoritative voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Officer, I believe you're unnecessarily detaining my mother. We should discuss your conduct and understanding of probable cause." The color drained from Officer Patterson's face as he turned around, finally noticing the imposing figure approaching them. He didn't recognize the man personally, but he certainly recognized the badge and credentials being held up. This was about to become the longest day of his career, and the crowd knew it, their phones capturing every moment of what was about to unfold. The autumn wind picked up, scattering more leaves across the parking lot, as justice prepared to take an unexpected turn in Sweet Pine Grove. The proud smile on Mrs. Robinson's face spoke volumes, not of vindication or revenge, but of hope that this moment might lead to positive change, one officer at a time. The badge in Mrs. Robinson's son's hand gleamed in the sunlight, Deputy Director of the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice. Officer Patterson's eyes widened as he read the credentials, his previous confidence evaporating like morning dew. The crowd watched in complete silence, phone still recording, as the scene unfolded before them. "Good morning, Officer Patterson," the Deputy Director's voice was calm but carried unmistakable authority. "I received several concerning calls about this incident. Would you mind explaining why you're detaining my mother without probable cause?" He stood protectively close to Mrs. Robinson, who remained as composed as ever. Officer Patterson struggled to find his voice, his hand dropping from his belt. "Sir, I was responding to reports of suspicious activity in the area. The words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Suspicious activity? The deputy director raised an eyebrow. Please elaborate on how my 73-year-old mother, a retired teacher known to everyone in this community, buying groceries on her regular shopping day, matches any reasonable definition of suspicious activity. Mrs. Robinson placed a gentle hand on her son's arm. Now, baby, don't be too hard on him. Sometimes the best lessons come from our mistakes. Her voice carried the wisdom of someone who had seen both progress and setbacks in the long march toward equality. The deputy director took a deep breath, clearly moved by his mother's grace under pressure. Officer Patterson, let's review what happened here. You saw an elderly woman struggling with her groceries and instead of offering assistance, you chose to initiate an investigative stop without reasonable suspicion. The growing crowd included several of Mrs. Robinson's former students, each with their own stories of how she had touched their lives. One was now the town's librarian, another a local business owner. They watched as their beloved teacher handled the situation with the same dignity she had shown in their classroom. I'd like to see your body camera footage, the deputy director continued, his tone professional but stern. And I'll be speaking with your supervisor about implementing additional training programs for the department. This isn't about punishment, Officer Patterson. It's about growth and understanding. Officer Patterson's face flushed with shame as the reality of his actions began to sink in. He looked at Mrs. Robinson, really looked at her for the first time, not as a suspect, but as a person. He saw the gentle lines around her eyes that spoke of years of both joy and hardship, the dignified way she carried herself despite his unfair treatment. Mrs. Robinson, He started, his voice cracking slightly. I apologize for my behavior. It was unprofessional and wrong. The words came out quietly, but they were sincere. Mrs. Robinson smiled softly, the same smile that had reassured countless students over her teaching career. Apology accepted, officer. But I hope you understand that this isn't just about me. It's about every person who looks like me, who might not have a son in the Justice Department to come to their aid. The deputy director nodded approvingly at his mother's words. Officer Patterson, I'd like you to join me tomorrow at my mother's Sunday dinner. We'll discuss how we can turn this incident into an opportunity for positive change in the department. The invitation caught both Officer Patterson and the crowd by surprise. Mrs. Robinson's Sunday dinners were legendary in Sweet Pine Grove, known as much for the wisdom shared around her table as for her famous sweet potato pie. I would be honored, sir, Officer Patterson managed to respond, understanding that this was both an opportunity and a lesson. Mrs. Thomas, the high school principal, stepped forward. Mrs. Robinson, let me help you with these groceries. Your ice cream's nearly melted. The simple gesture broke the tension, reminding everyone of how this incident had begun. As people began to help with the groceries, Mrs. Robinson turned to her son. You didn't have to come all this way, she said softly. Mama, I promised Dad before he passed that I'd always look out for you, he replied, helping her into her car. Besides, I've been meaning to visit. Work keeps me too busy in Washington. The crowd slowly dispersed, but the impact of what they'd witnessed would ripple through Sweet Pine Grove for a long time to come. Officer Patterson stood watching as Mrs. Robinson's car pulled away, her son following in his SUV. He felt the weight of his badge differently now, understanding that with authority comes the responsibility to protect and serve everyone in the community, regardless of their appearance. Tomorrow's Sunday dinner would be more than just a meal, it would be the beginning of a necessary conversation about change, understanding, and the power of treating everyone with dignity and respect. As the autumn leaves continued to fall around him, Officer Patterson realized that sometimes the best lessons come from our most humbling moments. The next morning, the sweet aroma of freshly baked cornbread wafted through Mrs. Robinson's modest two-story home. She had been up since dawn, her hands working with practiced precision as she prepared for her Sunday dinner. The morning light filtered through the kitchen windows, illuminating photographs that lined the walls, a visual timeline of her family's journey through the years. In her living room, her son sat reviewing incident reports from the police department. He'd spent the night in his old bedroom, now a guest room, though his childhood achievements still adorned the walls: debate team trophies, law school graduation photos, and newspaper clippings marking his rise through the ranks of the Justice Department. "Mama, you don't need to go all out today," he called out, hearing pots clanking in the kitchen. "This isn't supposed to be a comfortable situation for Officer Patterson." Mrs. Robinson's response carried her usual wisdom: "Baby, discomfort doesn't need help from cold food or bad hospitality. Sometimes the hardest conversations go down better with good cooking." Throughout the morning, neighbors dropped by with various contributions to the dinner. Mrs. Thomas brought her famous peach cobbler, while the town librarian arrived with fresh flowers to brighten up the table. Each visitor carried not just food, but stories about Mrs. Robinson's impact on their lives, shared in hushed tones with her son in the living room. Around noon, Officer Patterson's patrol car pulled up outside. He sat there for several long moments, gathering his courage. He had exchanged his uniform for pressed khakis and a button-down shirt, and under his arm, he carried an old photo album. Mrs. Robinson watched from her kitchen window as the young officer made his way up the walkway. The maple trees that lined her property showered him with red and gold leaves, nature's confetti marking his path to understanding. When the doorbell rang, it was Mrs. Robinson who answered, wearing her Sunday best and a warm smile. "Welcome to our home, Officer Patterson," she said, stepping aside to let him in. The deputy director stood in the living room, his stance professional but less intimidating than the day before. "Good afternoon, officer. I trust you had a reflective evening?" Officer Patterson nodded, gripping the photo album tighter. "Yes, sir. I brought something I'd like to share with Mrs. Robinson, if that's all right." His voice carried a nervousness that hadn't been present during yesterday's confrontation. As they settled in the living room, the scent of roasting chicken and sweet potatoes creating a homey atmosphere, Officer Patterson opened the album. "Mrs. Robinson, after I left yesterday, I called my grandmother. She reminded me of something I'd forgotten." He turned the album to show a yellowed photograph of a high school graduation. "This is my mother's graduation day, 1988. And this," he pointed to a younger Mrs. Robinson, standing proudly beside a teenage girl, "is you." Mrs. Robinson adjusted her glasses, leaning forward to study the photograph. "Little Rose Patterson," she said softly, recognition lighting up her face. "Oh, she was one of my brightest students. Always asking questions about Shakespeare." "My mother," Officer Patterson confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. "She passed away when I was young, but she always told me stories about the teacher who helped her fall in love with literature, who encouraged her to go to college even when everyone said she couldn't afford it." The deputy director sat forward, interest piqued. "You never mentioned this yesterday, officer." "I didn't realize. I didn't make the connection until I got home and saw your name in the paper. I called my grandmother, and she told me everything, how Mrs. Robinson helped my mother apply for scholarships, how she tutored her after school." He turned to Mrs. Robinson, eyes glistening. "My mother became an English teacher because of you. She taught for 10 years before we lost her to cancer." Mrs. Robinson reached out and patted his hand, her own eyes moist. "Rose had such a beautiful spirit. I see some of her in you, that same determination. She just needed someone to believe in her." The deputy director watched this exchange, understanding blooming on his face. "Sometimes our biases blind us to the connections we share," he observed quietly. "Even to our own histories." From the kitchen, the timer dinged, and Mrs. Robinson rose. "That'll be the cornbread. Officer Patterson, would you help me set the table?" My son knows better than to offer, he's been known to break my good china. As Officer Patterson followed Mrs. Robinson to the kitchen, the deputy director could hear his mother beginning to tell stories about Rose Patterson's high school days. Her voice carried the same warmth it had held in the classroom, weaving a narrative that bridged past and present. The autumn sunlight streamed through the dining room windows, catching the family photos on the walls, generations of Robinsons who had fought their own battles for dignity and respect. Now, in this moment, their legacy was helping to create understanding in an unexpected way. The table was being set not just for a meal, but for a conversation that would reshape perspectives in Sweet Pine Grove. As Mrs. Robinson placed her grandmother's old serving dishes on the table, she knew that sometimes the path to change wasn't through confrontation, but through connection, through the sharing of food, memories, and the recognition of our shared humanity. As steam rose from the dishes spread across Mrs. Robinson's dining table, the conversation flowed as naturally as the sweet tea being poured into crystal glasses. The deputy director watched with interest as his mother placed her hand-embroidered napkin in her lap, a gesture he'd seen thousands of times, but one that Officer Patterson now observed with newfound respect. "Before we begin," Mrs. Robinson said, her voice gentle but firm, "we say grace in this house. Officer Patterson, would you do us the honor?" The request wasn't just about prayer, it was an invitation to be part of their family tradition. Officer Patterson's voice trembled slightly as he said grace, his words speaking not just of the food before them, but of gratitude for understanding and second chances. As he finished, he opened his eyes to find Mrs. Robinson nodding approvingly. "Now then," she said, passing the cornbread, "tell me about your grandmother. How is she these days? She used to make the best sweet potato pies for our school bake sales." As they began to eat, the deputy director steered the conversation toward more serious matters. "Officer Patterson, I've been reviewing your department's training protocols. I'm curious about your perspective on community policing." The young officer paused, fork midway to his mouth. "Honestly, sir, after yesterday, I realize there's a lot I need to learn. We have the training, but it's different when you're on the street. Sometimes we get so focused on looking for trouble that we forget to look for humanity." Mrs. Robinson cut her chicken methodically as she listened. "You know," she said, "when I first started teaching, some parents didn't want their children in my classroom. They saw my color before they saw my capabilities. But I kept showing up, kept teaching with everything I had, until they saw me as Mrs. Robinson the teacher, not just a black woman in their white school." "That must have been incredibly difficult," Officer Patterson said softly, thinking of his own mother facing similar challenges. "It was," she acknowledged, "but difficulty often carries the best lessons. Like yesterday, it was uncomfortable for everyone involved, but look at us now, sharing a meal and having an honest conversation." The deputy director leaned forward. "That's actually what I wanted to discuss. Officer Patterson, would you be willing to help implement a new community engagement program in your department? Something that goes beyond traditional sensitivity training?" "What kind of program, sir?" Patterson asked, his professional interest piqued. "One that brings officers into regular contact with community elders, local teachers, and youth leaders, not for enforcement, but for connection. Regular dinners like this one, community forums, ride-alongs with respected community members." Mrs. Robinson's eyes lit up. "Like when we used to have teachers ride the school bus through different neighborhoods at the start of each year. It helped us understand where our students were coming from." As they continued eating, Officer Patterson shared stories about his early days on the force, about the pressure to be tough, to maintain authority at all costs. Mrs. Robinson listened intently, occasionally adding her own insights from decades of teaching young people about respect and dignity. "You know," she said, serving him a second helping of green beans, "authority isn't about making people fear you. It's about earning their respect. In all my years of teaching, I never had to raise my voice to maintain order in my classroom." The deputy director smiled. Mama once made a student write an essay about respect after he disrupted class. He became a state senator later, still quotes her in his speeches. Officer Patterson absorbed these words, thinking about his own approach to authority. Mrs. Robinson, how did you handle it when students came in with preconceived notions about you? I killed them with kindness, she replied with a twinkle in her eye. And competence. Those two things together are unstoppable. As the afternoon light began to soften, casting long shadows across the dining room, the conversation turned to practical steps for change. The deputy director outlined his ideas for department reform, while Officer Patterson contributed insights from the ground level. Mrs. Robinson listened, occasionally offering the kind of wisdom that only comes from decades of breaking down barriers with grace and persistence. Sometimes, she said, serving her homemade peach cobbler, the biggest changes start with the smallest gestures. A kind word here, a moment of respect there. Before you know it, you've built a bridge where there used to be a wall. Officer Patterson looked around the room, taking in the family photos, the academic achievements, the life of service and dignity represented in every corner. He thought about how differently this Sunday could have gone if he'd maintained his defensive stance from yesterday. Mrs. Robinson, he said finally, I'd like to come back next Sunday, if you'll have me. Not as part of any program, but just to learn more. About your experiences, about my mother's time in your class, about how to be better at my job. The smile that spread across Mrs. Robinson's face was warm enough to fill the room. Sunday dinner is at 2 p.m. sharp, she said. And next time, bring your grandmother. I'd love to catch up with her properly. As the sun began to set outside, casting an amber glow through the windows, the three of them continued talking, planning, and building bridges across generations of misunderstanding. The sweet aroma of peach cobbler lingered in the air, a reminder that sometimes the best lessons in life come served with a side of hospitality and an open heart. The following week brought unexpected changes to Sweet Pine Grove. The video of Mrs. Robinson's encounter with Officer Patterson had gone viral, but what caught people's attention wasn't just the confrontation, it was the resolution. Local news stations picked up the story of the Sunday dinner, turning it into a symbol of how communities could address tensions with law enforcement. At the police department, Officer Patterson sat in the chief's office, explaining his proposal for a new community engagement initiative. The chief listened intently as Patterson shared what he'd learned over dinner at Mrs. Robinson's table. Sir, we've been doing this all wrong, Patterson explained, spreading out his handwritten notes. We treat community outreach like a box to check, but Mrs. Robinson showed me it's about building real relationships. The chief leaned back in his chair, studying the young officer. The change in Patterson was evident. Gone was the overly aggressive rookie, replaced by someone who seemed to have gained years of wisdom in just a few days. Meanwhile, at Pine Grove High School, Mrs. Robinson had been invited to speak at a special assembly. She stood at the podium where she had once given countless morning announcements, looking out at a sea of young faces, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, all eager to hear her story. What happened in that parking lot wasn't just about me and Officer Patterson, she began, her voice carrying to the back of the auditorium. It was about choices. Every day, we choose how to treat each other. We choose whether to let fear and prejudice guide us, or whether to open our hearts to understanding. In the audience, Officer Patterson sat in uniform, having taken his lunch break to attend. Next to him sat his grandmother, who had reconnected with Mrs. Robinson, and was now helping to organize community dinners across town. You see, Mrs. Robinson continued, change doesn't always come from big gestures or loud protests. Sometimes it comes from a simple invitation to dinner, from listening to each other's stories, from recognizing our shared humanity. The deputy director, who had extended his stay in Sweet Pine Grove, was working with the police department to implement new training protocols. But more importantly, he was helping to establish regular community forums where officers and residents could meet in informal settings. At the local diner, where Mrs. Robinson often stopped for her morning coffee, the owner had put up a new sign, "Everyone welcome here, no badge or background check required." It was a small gesture of humor that carried a deeper message about acceptance and trust. Officer Patterson's patrol routine had changed too. He started parking his car and walking through neighborhoods, learning people's names, stopping to chat with elderly residents on their porches. He kept a photo of his mother's graduation class in his wallet now, a reminder of the impact one person's kindness could have across generations. One afternoon, he spotted Mrs. Robinson struggling with grocery bags again. This time, he rushed to help without hesitation. "Let me get those for you, Mrs. Robinson," he said, earning a warm smile from his former adversary turned mentor. "Thank you, officer," she replied, then added with a twinkle in her eye, "You're still coming to dinner this Sunday, right? I'm making your mother's favorite, butterscotch pie from her old recipe." The local newspaper ran a feature story about the changes in Sweet Pine Grove. The headline read, "From Confrontation to Conversation, How One Sunday Dinner Changed a Town." The article detailed how other communities were starting to adopt similar initiatives, creating spaces for dialogue between law enforcement and residents. At the police academy, Officer Patterson had been invited to share his experience with new recruits. He stood before them, nervous but determined, just as he had been at Mrs. Robinson's dinner table. "Your badge gives you authority," he told them, "but it's your humanity that gives you the power to make real change. I learned that from a retired teacher who had every right to be angry with me, but chose to teach me instead." Back at her house, Mrs. Robinson was going through old yearbooks with Officer Patterson's grandmother, sharing stories about former students. The two women had rekindled their friendship, finding common ground in their hopes for a better future for their grandchildren. "You know," Mrs. Robinson mused, "when my son became deputy director, I was so proud. But I'm equally proud now, seeing how this community has chosen to grow from what could have been just another sad incident." The deputy director, who had been making regular trips back to Sweet Pine Grove, noticed other changes too. The town's annual festival now included a community dialogue tent, where residents and police officers could share stories and concerns in a relaxed setting. Local businesses had started a mentorship program, pairing officers with community leaders for monthly lunch meetings. Even the grocery store parking lot where it all began had been transformed. The store owner had designated it as a community connection space, with benches and tables where people could gather and chat. Officer Patterson often parked his patrol car there during his break, sharing coffee with locals and listening to their stories. As autumn turned to winter in Sweet Pine Grove, the changes that had begun with a confrontation and a Sunday dinner continued to grow. Mrs. Robinson's wisdom had sparked something that went beyond police training programs or community initiatives. She had shown how the simple act of seeing each other's humanity could transform a community. The Sunday dinner tradition had expanded too. Now, every month, different families in Sweet Pine Grove took turns hosting police officers for meals and conversation. It wasn't always easy, and sometimes the discussions were uncomfortable, but as Mrs. Robinson often said, the best growth happens when we're willing to be uncomfortable together. 3 months after the parking lot incident, Sweet Pine Grove had become a case study in community transformation. The deputy director sat in his Washington office, reviewing reports from various cities requesting information about what the media had dubbed the Sweet Pine Grove model. But it was a text message from Officer Patterson that really caught his attention. "Your mother just helped me talk down a tense situation at the high school," the message read. "She still teaches us all, doesn't she?" The situation Officer Patterson referred to had occurred that morning. A young student had been caught with suspicious items in his backpack, and the initial response had been to call the police. But instead of immediately rushing in with authority, Patterson had remembered Mrs. Robinson's lessons about dignity and understanding. He'd found Mrs. Robinson in the library, reading to elementary school children as she did every Wednesday morning. "I need your expertise," he'd said simply, and she had understood immediately. Together, they had approached the troubled student. Mrs. Robinson had recognized him as the grandson of one of her former students, a family struggling with recent hardships. Instead of an interrogation, she and Officer Patterson had engaged him in a conversation about his dreams, his struggles, and his fears. "You remind me of another young man I taught years ago," Mrs. Robinson had told the student. "He was angry at the world too. Now he's a successful business owner in town. Would you like to meet him?" This approach, combining law enforcement with community wisdom, had turned a potential crisis into an opportunity for intervention and support. The student was now enrolled in a mentorship program that Officer Patterson had helped establish, connecting troubled youth with successful community members. At the weekly community dinner, now hosted at the local community center to accommodate growing attendance, Mrs. Robinson watched with satisfaction as officers and residents shared meals and stories. Officer Patterson had become a regular fixture at these gatherings, often bringing new recruits to learn from the community's elders. "You see," she explained to a group of young officers, "every person you encounter has a story. When you take the time to learn these stories, it changes how you serve and protect. You begin to protect dreams, not just property. You serve hopes, not just laws." The deputy director had used Sweet Pine Grove's transformation as leverage to implement similar programs nationwide. Police departments across the country were sending representatives to learn from what this small town had accomplished. But he knew the real credit belonged to his mother's wisdom and Officer Patterson's willingness to learn. At the police department, changes were evident in small but significant ways. Officers now started their shifts by reading a quote displayed prominently in the briefing room: "Authority is earned through respect, not demanded through fear," words Mrs. Robinson had spoken over that first Sunday dinner. Officer Patterson had been promoted to Community Relations Lieutenant, but he still patrolled the streets regularly. His approach had changed dramatically. He knew most residents by name, understood their concerns, and had become a trusted figure in the community. One afternoon, he responded to a call at the grocery store where it had all begun. An elderly shopper had become confused and agitated. Instead of immediately asserting authority, Patterson sat with her, learned she was Mrs. Robinson's contemporary, and called her family while sharing stories about the town's history. The store manager, watching this interaction, remembered the contrast with that autumn day just months ago. "It's like watching a completely different person," he commented to Mrs. Robinson, who had stopped by for her weekly shopping. "Not different," she corrected gently. "Just awakened to his better self. We all have that capacity within us." The impact rippled beyond law enforcement. Local schools had implemented programs teaching conflict resolution and community engagement. Business owners had created internship opportunities for at-risk youth. The town council had established a community advisory board where residents and police officers worked together to address concerns. Mrs. Robinson's son had used the Sweet Pine Grove success story to push for policy changes at the federal level. But he knew the real change happened person by person, story by story, dinner by dinner. At her regular Sunday dinners, now attended by a rotating group of officers and community members, Mrs. Robinson still served her famous sweet potato pie. But she served something else too: wisdom, understanding, and a model for how communities could heal their divisions. Officer Patterson's grandmother had become a regular at these gatherings, often bringing old photographs and stories that connected different generations of Sweet Pine Grove residents. These stories revealed how interconnected their community had always been, even when they hadn't realized it. "Remember," Mrs. Robinson would say, passing the cornbread, "we're not just changing policies. We're changing hearts. And that happens one conversation at a time." The local high school had started an annual award in Mrs. Robinson's name, recognizing students who demonstrated exceptional community leadership and bridge building. The first recipient had been a young man who started a program pairing police officers with students for weekly mentoring sessions. As winter deepened in Sweet Pine Grove, the warmth of these changes continued to spread. The parking lot incident had become more than just a viral video, it had become a catalyst for genuine transformation. But as Mrs. Robinson often reminded everyone, the real work was in maintaining these changes, in continuing to choose understanding over confrontation, day after day. The true test, she would say, isn't in making changes when everyone's watching. It's in living those changes when the cameras are gone and the spotlight has moved on. That's when we show who we really are. 1 year after the parking lot incident, Sweet Pine Grove hosted a special community celebration in the town square. The autumn leaves were falling just as they had been that fateful day, but everything else had changed. Mrs. Robinson stood at the podium, looking out at faces that were no longer divided between law enforcement and civilians, but united as one community. A year ago, she began, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd, I went to buy groceries, and ended up buying something much more valuable, understanding. A gentle laugh rippled through the audience. But what happened that day wasn't just about me, or Officer Patterson, or even Sweet Pine Grove. It was about choosing to see each other's humanity when it would have been easier to look away. The deputy director sat in the front row, beside Officer, now Lieutenant, Patterson. Both men had changed over the past year. The deputy director had implemented similar community engagement programs in cities across the country, while Patterson had become a nationally recognized speaker on community policing. Mrs. Robinson continued, people often ask me why I invited the officer who profiled me to Sunday dinner. They say I should have been angry, should have demanded punishment. But you see, I've spent my life teaching young people, and I know that the best lessons aren't taught through punishment, but through understanding. In the audience, Officer Patterson's grandmother wiped away tears, remembering how her own daughter, Patterson's mother, had blossomed under Mrs. Robinson's guidance years ago. The photograph from that graduation day now hung in the police department's training room, alongside Mrs. Robinson's quote about authority and respect. What happened in our town wasn't magic, Mrs. Robinson explained. It was choice. Every day, we chose to do the harder thing, to talk instead of shout, to listen instead of assume, to understand instead of accuse. And yes, sometimes we failed. But we got back up and tried again. The changes in Sweet Pine Grove had caught national attention. News crews were present at the celebration, capturing what many called a miracle of community transformation. But the real miracle wasn't in the big moments, it was in the small, daily interactions that had become routine. Officers now regularly attended community events and not as security, but as participants. The police department's training program, redesigned with input from community leaders, had become a model for other cities. The Sunday dinner tradition had spread beyond Mrs. Robinson's home, with families throughout town hosting regular meals that brought together officers and residents. Lieutenant Patterson stepped up to the podium next. A year ago, I was a different person, he admitted. I thought authority came from making people fear you. Mrs. Robinson taught me that real authority comes from earning people's trust. She didn't just change my approach to policing, she changed my understanding of community. The celebration included presentations from various community members. A teenage boy spoke about how the new mentorship program had helped him find direction. A rookie officer shared how her training under the new system had given her tools for connection rather than confrontation. Business owners described how increased trust had improved everyday interactions. Mrs. Robinson's son took the podium last. What my mother started here wasn't just about improving police-community relations, he explained. It was about remembering that we're all part of the same human family. The badge doesn't change that. The uniform doesn't change that. Our differences don't change that. As the formal ceremony ended, people gathered around tables laden with food, a community potluck that represented the diversity of Sweet Pine Grove. Mrs. Robinson's sweet potato pie sat alongside dishes from every cultural tradition in town. Walking through the crowd, Mrs. Robinson stopped to chat with familiar faces. She saw former students who were now community leaders, officers who had become friends, and young people who carried hope instead of fear in their eyes when they saw a police car. At one table, she overheard Lieutenant Patterson talking to a group of new officers. "The most important tool you have isn't your badge or your gun, it's your humanity. Never forget that every person you encounter is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's teacher." The deputy director joined his mother, watching the interactions around them. "You know, Mama," he said softly, "what you started here is spreading. Cities across the country are adopting the Sweet Pine Grove model. But they all ask the same question: how do you replicate something that began with one person's choice to respond to prejudice with grace?" Mrs. Robinson smiled, watching as children played nearby, completely unconcerned about whether adults around them wore badges or civilian clothes. "You don't replicate it," she answered. "You inspire it. Every community has its own Mrs. Robinsons, its own Officer Pattersons. They just need to know it's possible to choose a different way." As the sun began to set over Sweet Pine Grove, casting long shadows across the town square, the celebration continued. But it wasn't just a celebration of what had been accomplished, it was a commitment to continuing the work they'd begun. The parking lot where it all started had been renamed Unity Square, with a small plaque that read, "Where ending conflict begins with understanding." Mrs. Robinson often parked there for her weekly shopping, no longer feeling anxiety but hope that what had happened in Sweet Pine Grove could happen anywhere people chose to see each other's humanity. "The story doesn't end here," Mrs. Robinson told a reporter who asked about Sweet Pine Grove's future. "In fact, it's just beginning. Because now we know something important: change isn't about waiting for someone else to fix things. It's about looking in the mirror and deciding to be part of the solution, one conversation, one Sunday dinner, one act of understanding at a time."